At one point, you mentioned in passing I wrote it down here. I believe it's that universities have a suffocating left-wing monoculture. One would expect that universities would be the first place to kind of be pushing rational discourse. What do you think explains the evacuation of rationality from universities, and what is the best way to kind of try and bring it back to these places where that seems to be the whole point, and certainly was, at least the origin story of universities?
I think that everyone is tempted by a goal that is not the same as the goal of pursuing objective truth, of being on the side of a prestigious coalition. And we all have a kind of acute antennae for which way the coalitions are forming, a terror of being in a minority coalition. And so it is a kind of herd mentality that no one is immune to. As a kind of a paradoxical byproduct of some of the progress that we've made, namely racism really has gone down, and
Right.
sexual harassment and sexism and so on. It creates an opening for a moralistic crusade in which you can be on the side of the angels, and you can and do your darndest not to be on the receiving end of the moral indignation. That's a game that got it didn't begin in the last decade or so. I remember it from when I was an undergraduate. It had already begun, the idea that academics are some kind of moral beacons, and that beacon really consisting of condemning the heretics and the reprobates, the attacks on E.O. Wilson, the biologist, by his Harvard colleagues. Richard Lewontin and Stephen Jay Gould were an early example of that. And I wouldn't have predicted that it would become kind of the dominant ethos of the university, finding bad people to demonize.
It's kind of interesting, by the way, just to stop on that for a second, that really started in the sciences, because oftentimes kind of political moralizing or ideological moralizing is seen as something that, starts and stops in the humanities and social sciences.
That is interesting, yeah. And John Haidt has been most explicit in saying that universities really have to choose whether their telos is advancing knowledge or advancing some political cause, in this case, social justice defined as relative standing among groups. That you can't do both, because reality is going to sometimes confound your moralistic narrative.
Can I ask you, just as a bit of biography, I mean, you somewhat famously grew up in a Jewish section of Montreal or of Canada, which kind of makes you an outsider if you're English speaking in Quebec, you're already an outsider. And then if you're not part of the kind of Anglo Canadian establishment and whatnot. But do you think that there's anything in your biography that kind of predisposes you to being comfortable speaking from a minority point of view, or going against that herd mentality that you talk about? Or is that, how do we develop that in people who maybe, wouldn't necessarily have been raised in that kind of context?
Yeah, it's possible. I think I've also been kind of practical and mindful of what I can get away with without just being canceled and vanishing into obscurity. That I've taken advantage of this peculiar custom of tenure, and have been more outspoken when I know that I wouldn't kind of lose my livelihood for saying unpopular things. I think coming from social sciences with just a mindset that deep, interesting ideas about politics, human nature, meaning of life, can be and ought to be shaped by empirical observations, by data. It's that overriding mindset that I like to think that motivates me in these other questions.
One of the in the final section of your book, when you're talking about why it matters, you say that rationality is a public good, and you use Wikipedia as an example of how, in a kind of public sphere of debate and discussion, we can use rationality, but also, as you stress throughout the book and you've said today, you need to be able to constantly be checking your bias, or to make sure that you're not baking in your own, my side bias or confirmation bias or motivated reasoning. How does Wikipedia work as a kind of good way of producing knowledge, but also kind of checking to make sure that people aren't just kind of going down a rabbit hole of just those stories that, validate whatever their priors were?
Yeah, it's come as a surprise to almost everyone how good Wikipedia is. Certainly in its early years, and most people say this can't possibly work. You have an encyclopedia where
It's the online encyclopedia that anyone can edit, right? What a disaster.
What a disaster. And in the early years, it was a disaster. I mean, the articles in the first couple of years were embarrassing. But so it did implement a set of rules of checks and balances under the overarching ethos or telos, if you want to use fancy words, of objectivity and truth. There are 5 pillars of Wikipedia. These are principles that all the Wikipedians sign on to. And foremost among them is accuracy and objective truth. So there's the overall commitment, and then there are the mechanisms where one person doesn't get to bang his drum or ride his hobby horse. If he or she does, more often he, then someone else with a different hobby horse will erase that edit. It doesn't always work, but of course, the Britannica didn't always work either.
Right.
And what it shows is that it isn't that digital media are inherently cesspools of fake news. It depends on the rules of the game. And again, yet another lesson is that you can't predict a priori what is going to work. You have to see how things unfold and measure their accuracy. At the beginning of social media, a lot of people thought that this would be a birth of new enlightenment, because at the time, and you and I are old enough to remember when the problem with the press is, as they used to say, freedom of the press goes with those who own one. And you had Noam Chomsky with manufacturing consent and an oligarchy of a small number of corporations. And what we really need is that anyone could publish. Well, we got what we asked for.
Yeah. So are you, I guess, to kind of end the conversation, are you optimistic about the ability for people to generate rules of the game? And obviously there's going to be many kind of scenario or many areas that people are doing this, and they're going to be overlapping and oftentimes contradicting themselves, or different groups. I mean, this is part of the Enlightenment, right? It's really a process. It's not a threshold that you cross, or a plateau that you reach. Are you optimistic that we're going to get better at kind of creating the institutions and the norms that will make us be more rational, which will lead to more progress and also kind of better social amity?
Yeah, I think it'll be, as someone who believes in human nature, I don't think we'll ever have an epistemic utopia. I think there'll always be conspiracy theories and fake news. Will our institutions kind of develop the right workarounds or better ones? It'll probably vary by country, that the mechanisms of democracy we know can promote or demote data-driven decision-making. Different institutions will succeed or fail. The fact that so many people are aware of the hazards means that there is some hope that we'll develop some workarounds. But there'll always be some amount of chaos and a background hubbub of nonsense.
Do you have, as a final question, do you have a particularly embarrassing belief that is obviously not rational?
Well, I guess if I'm probably not the right person to judge, because we all are subject to bias. All of us think that everyone else is biased, but not me. And it's like the preface paradox. You open a book and every preface says, "Remaining errors are my fault." You say, well, why don't you correct them? And of course, the answer is, I don't know which ones they are, at least not yet.
So you don't have any irrational beliefs. You don't believe in UFOs or vitamin C therapy or anything like that.
I don't have any fringe beliefs, although some might say that a belief that progress has taken place is a fringe belief.
Yeah, that's a strange one. I guess just as a final question, at some point, I know over the years we've talked about Bob Dylan, and we both admire him greatly. How excited were you when he won the Nobel Prize for Literature?
As much of a Dylan fan as I am, I actually was not kind of down with that decision, just because there's already such fame and rewards and notoriety to popular musicians, whereas literature is a tougher game and something that is designed to amplify those guys. I think would have been better suited. Maybe we would need a different kind of prize. But it would have been nice, I think, if a novelist gained greater fame through an allocation of that
I
prize.
guess he himself was ambivalent about it, right? Because it took him a couple of weeks or a month to get back to the committee. So,
he'd have to be. If he wasn't there, he wouldn't be Dylan. Oh my God! If he immediately said, "Thank you, this is the honor of my life," he'd say, "Oh my God, what happened to Bob Dylan?"
Yeah, I was kind of hoping he'd join Sartre in rejecting it, but Dylan never fully satisfies his audience, so that's part of what makes him great.
And that's crucial. Absolutely.
Yeah.